Why am I here? What is the purpose of my life? What's the point if it's all going to end? These are the questions that, sooner or later, each of us comes to ask ourselves during the course of our lives. And these were the very questions that haunted the mind of one of the greatest philosophers of all time, Lev Tolstoy. Despite having achieved almost everything he could have wished for in life, fame, wealth, a loving family, and success, Tolstoy found himself in conflict with his own mind, with such deeply disturbing thoughts. Often considered one of the most important authors of his time, Tolstoy became famous through two great literary masterpieces, War and Peace and Anna Karenina, which remain to this day two of the most celebrated works of world literature. Tolstoy was born in 1828 in the district of Shekino, Russia, to a noble family, and thanks to this, he had a comfortable life, dedicated to his studies, and thanks to the family inheritance, he found himself shortly afterwards managing a vast agricultural estate. He had a splendid family and was married to a very loving wife. However, although on the surface all these achievements seemed to satisfy him, something changed radically on his 50th birthday. Suddenly, nihilistic thoughts struck him impetuously, and all the happiness he had seemed to have found up to that point vanished. A man who had previously lived life to its full potential, pursuing everything that brought him pleasure, suddenly found himself questioning the meaning of his life, consumed by an inner emptiness. But how did such a brilliant man as Lev Tolstoy come to lose meaning and hope? More importantly, what triggered this sudden change? The Philosopher Who Rediscovered the True Meaning of Life, a modern spirituality production. From an early age, Lev Tolstoy showed a strong skepticism towards Christianity. Orphaned of both parents, shortly after his birth, he soon felt abandoned and disillusioned, and the church at that time failed to provide him with the answers he sought. Tolstoy himself stated, "Now, as in the old days, religious doctrine accepted by faith and supported by external pressure is gradually abandoned under the influence of knowledge and life experience, which are often in conflict with it." His youth, marked by tragedy and doubt, laid the foundation for the difficulties he would later encounter in his relationship with faith. For almost 50 years, Tolstoy led a life seemingly free of major worries. He was rich, successful, and surrounded by a family that loved him. But then, suddenly, everything changed. He was struck by a profound and overwhelming intellectual and existential crisis. Sleep became his only refuge. Only by sleeping did he find temporary relief from the overwhelming weight of questions about the meaning of life and his existence. In his essay Confession, Tolstoy describes how, during that period, he was forced to deceive himself in order not to take his own life. He was consumed by nihilism as his thoughts accumulated in a spiral of anguish. At that moment, the yoke of restlessness, the lack of meaning and purpose in his life destabilized him, until he reached a point where the only questions he asked himself were, why? Why life? Why existence? Why death? Tolstoy believed that there was something deeply wrong with his soul. In Anna Karenina, the character of Levin reflects this inner conflict. Like Tolstoy, Levin found himself trapped in an endless circle of questions about the meaning of life and death. Tolstoy wrote, "If not now, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then in 30 years. Does it make any difference?" Capturing the sheer sense of despair that characterized his thoughts at that time. This constant torment even led him to contemplate suicide, but fortunately for us, instead of ending his life, he decided to take a different path, a journey in search of peace. He immersed himself in the study of philosophy, science, and various ideologies in an attempt to answer those questions that continued to haunt him. One of the decisive moments in his journey was a parable he reflected on deeply, a story he included in his essay, Confession. The parable tells of a man fleeing from a wild beast who ends up stumbling into an abandoned well. Desperate, he throws himself into the well to escape the beast, only to discover a dragon lurking at the bottom, its jaws wide open. In panic, the man clings to a branch growing from the walls of the well, hoping to avoid the dragon. In this desperate situation, the man noticed drops of honey on the leaves of the branch he was holding onto. Despite the danger, he stretches out his hand to taste the honey, momentarily distracted by the threat that surrounded him. Tolstoy saw in this parable a reflection of his own life. He realized that, like the man in the well, he was trapped between two extremes. On the one hand, the fear of death and emptiness. On the other, the brief joys of life that, like honey, offered only temporary but insufficient relief. This parable could lead to a kind of despair, but instead of giving in to it, he chose to explore the intrinsic meaning of life, investigating almost every ideology he came into contact with. He first turned to philosophy. Tolstoy read the works of many philosophers, including Solomon, Socrates, and Buddha, but found no definitive answers in any of them. He felt that their teachings ultimately led to an overly materialistic and bleak conclusion. Quote, "Happy is he who is never born. Death is better than life, and one must free oneself from life." Similarly, he turned to science, which he considered a source of knowledge, but found little comfort in it. He considered Darwinism to be the embodiment of scientific nihilism, suggesting that human beings were nothing more than an accidental creation of the universe. According to biology, we are mere masses of energy, valuable only when we are healthy, and destined to die when our cells age. For Tolstoy, science offered no consolation about the purpose of life or how to live peacefully, free from the existential thoughts that tormented him. Disillusioned with both philosophy and science, Tolstoy began to study and observe the people around him. After a long inner reflection, which lasted for years, he came to the conclusion that, for those in his social class, there were four main ways to cope with this terrible condition that sooner or later we will all have to face. The first of these ways was to accept the absurdity of life. We can see many similarities between Tolstoy's perspective on existence and Albert Camus' philosophy of the absurd. Both shared the view that dealing with the absurdity of life required a simple approach, but nonetheless one that was not without depth and value. In fact, Tolstoy observed that one way some people dealt with the absurdity of life was to simply ignore it. They do nothing about it. They do not think too much about it. Life is absurd, so what? They just live it. Even Albert Camus argued that instead of succumbing to despair or nihilism in the face of absurdity, one should adopt an attitude of defiance and resilience. The key is to maintain a different mindset. Can't find the answer? Go have coffee with your wife and forget about it. However, Tolstoy did not believe that this could be a lasting solution. How can one remain ignorant when one has a fully functioning mind, constantly driven to question existence? The death of a loved one or personal difficulties make these thoughts even more difficult to ignore. Eventually, the weight of nihilism takes over, and the absurd no longer offers any escape. While recognizing that some people face life in this way, Tolstoy did not consider it a path to lasting peace. This led him to identify a second group of people who pursued peace through Epicureanism, or the philosophical doctrine founded by Epicurus. Tolstoy noticed that some people took refuge in a life of pleasures, filling it with gratifications to distract themselves from the suffering and uncertainty of existence. To escape the fear of death and emptiness of meaning, they pursued material wealth, relationships, and entertainment. Through these distractions, they sought to anesthetize their existential angst by immersing themselves in pleasure that, although temporary, seemed to offer relief. However, Tolstoy severely criticized this approach. Although indulgence in pleasures may offer temporary relief, it is fleeting and incapable of answering the deeper questions about the meaning of life. For Tolstoy, living exclusively for pleasure leads to an endless cycle of dissatisfaction. No amount of gratification can resolve fundamental existential questions. In his view, Epicureanism was akin to the drops of honey in the parable of the man in the well, sweet for a moment, but ultimately nothing more than a distraction from the harsh realities of life. The third group Tolstoy observed were those who, faced with life's struggles, did not have the strength to go on, but found the courage to end what they called a stupid joke. These people were overwhelmed by the absurdity of existence. They could not see a way out. Tolstoy, tormented as he was, could not accept this method. Although he recognized why some people came to consider ending their own lives, he firmly believed that even this was not a just solution. Now I want to open a small parenthesis for you who are watching this film. Never, under any circumstances, consider such a decision. If you find yourself in a difficult situation, keep going. Don't let it consume you. Search with an open mind. The answers may not come right away, but with time, they will reveal themselves. Life, however complex and sometimes painful, always offers possibilities for meaning and growth that can emerge when you least expect it. However, even this was not a path Tolstoy could accept. Instead, he identified a fourth method, which he described as a state of existential limbo. This state occurs when an individual, having recognized the absence of intrinsic meaning in life, its inevitable pain, the certainty of death, and the absence of an obvious purpose, feels trapped between two extremes. These people do not find the strength, hope, or energy to react. Tolstoy observed that these, unlike all the other conditions described so far, do nothing. They do not reject life, but neither do they accept it. They are trapped in a state of passive resignation. They recognize the problem, but feel too empty or defeated to face it. This is not an active choice to continue living, but rather a form of anesthetized survival, a kind of spiritual exhaustion. These individuals simply exist, unable to move on. Tolstoy considered this the weakest way to live, because it offers neither resolution nor progress. The individual is fully aware of the absurdity of life and existential challenges, but remains stuck, unable to move in any direction. This state of limbo leaves people emotionally and spiritually paralyzed, suspended in their pain with no real hope of finding purpose or meaning. Tolstoy recognized that none of these conditions were a solution, but rather a passive and powerless form of survival, which did not lead to any kind of solution or concrete hope. During his journey in search of the meaning of life, Tolstoy carefully observed those around him, but it was the poor who marked a significant turning point in his understanding of the purpose of existence. He was deeply impressed by the fact that the peasants, despite the immense hardships they faced, maintained an unshakable faith in God. This faith seemed to offer them extraordinary purpose and resilience, even in the face of suffering. In stark contrast, Tolstoy, trapped in his own existential torments, found himself distant from such a faith. The simple but firm conviction of the peasant represented a stark contrast to his intellectual uncertainties and inner turmoil. Despite having achieved wealth and intellectual success, Tolstoy found himself at a crossroads. Material goods and social status no longer gave him peace and satisfaction. The search for reason and logic, which once seemed to promise answers, had instead led him to an even darker abyss of despair. This crisis echoed the moments of deep doubt experienced by Levin in Anna Karenina, where the search for meaning seemed vain and unresolved. However, Tolstoy's encounter with the faith of the poor peasants challenged his perspective. He began to realize that life could not be fully understood through reason alone. It required faith in something greater than the material world. This realization marked a profound turning point in Tolstoy's life. Although he did not initially believe in God, he began to recognize that faith, particularly faith in the infinite, was the key to transcending the limits of the finite world. This new approach allowed him to glimpse a possibility of meaning that could not be achieved through rational thought alone, but was rooted in spirituality and a sense of the divine. The sufferings and difficulties of human life, though painful, were temporary, while the eternal presence of God offered a purpose that could give meaning to his life beyond the transience of existence. In this new understanding, faith became for Tolstoy not just an intellectual concept, but a way to face life's challenges and find meaning in the face of suffering. Although his rational mind saw faith as a leap into the void, lacking tangible evidence, Tolstoy came to understand it as the only path to true peace and authentic purpose. By embracing this conviction, Tolstoy was able to overcome despair and find genuine contentment. His life thus underwent a drastic and total transformation. He adopted a simpler lifestyle, dedicating himself to the welfare of others and committing himself to a life characterized by humility and care for others. With this renewed faith, Tolstoy finally found a new meaning, a new purpose, dedicating his entire life to helping the poor with sacrifice and humility and total devotion to God. And in the end, Tolstoy's life, once dominated by intellectual torment, found its meaning in the very faith he had so much denied. But his version of faith did not end up being entirely in line with the Orthodox Christianity common in Imperial Russia. Rather, it was deeply rooted in the word of Jesus Christ, his belief in the infinite, and his spiritual understanding of God. And this gave him the satisfaction he had long sought. It was neither wealth nor intellectual achievements that gave meaning to his life, but trust in something greater than himself. What initially seemed to him a surrender of reason, a surrender of his rational mind, turned out to be the only path that allowed him to find peace. Tolstoy therefore began to lead a more modest life, donating much of his wealth, a gesture that was not appreciated by his family. He finally spent his last years living with honesty and sincere devotion, finally finding the peace he had long sought. And finally, Lev Tolstoy died on the 20th November 1910 at the age of 82, and will be remembered as one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, leaving behind a legacy of wisdom and humility, which to this day continues to inspire thousands of people around the world. And what do you think of Lev Tolstoy? Do you identify with one of his 4 conditions? Let us know in the comments section. And if you like this content, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like so that other people can see this content. Thank you, and see you soon.